Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Thank you so much for joining and continuing in the Nahjal Balagha book club. It's a pleasure to see so many of you back here, alhamdulillah. And to those of you who are listening live on Facebook as well, thank you so much for tuning in. This is obviously an interactive book club in which we are going through different themes of Nahjal Balagha. Those of you who were here last week, we set ourselves one of the most famous excerpts of this book as the cause of our discussion today. And that famous excerpt is, of course, the letter of Imam Ali Islam to Malik al-Ashtar, letter 53, which the Imam sends to Malik when he is assuming becoming the governor of Egypt. And that letter, as all of you know, is famous. It's famous for its principles. It's famous for how it has been embraced by non-Muslims as well as Muslims. And indeed, some of our most famous and well-known sayings of the Imam originate from this letter. For example, the most famous one, that a person is either your brother in faith or your equal in humanity. That's from this letter that we're looking at today. Now, I set this reading last week, hoping inshallah people will read, but I forgot to remember just how long a letter it is. So I'm going to assume that if you try to read it, inshallah you got through all of it, but if not, maybe you got through only the first few parts. So what I'll do is I'll give a summary of the letter, inshallah, to know what it is, what's contained in it, and then we'll dive into some of the main themes of this letter. Before I do, though, here's why we selected this letter of all of the, all of the different themes that we were going to choose. The reason why was because we are very interested in the idea of adl and justice. That is one of our key themes. I'm just changing one of the settings here so that I can be heard better. One moment. There we go. So we're very much interested in adl and justice of God. Last week we looked at Tawheed. We looked at how the Imam speaks about Allah, how the Imam introduces Allah in Sermon 1. And what we found was some beautiful description of the character of Allah Azza wa Jal, his parts, him not having parts, the way we have an idea of Allah linked to the real existing haqiqat of Allah. And we looked at the idea that we can know God by his creation. It's one of the ways we can know him. And we can know God by his qualities. As long as we understand that those qualities come from our mind in trying to understand him, we can use every single quality as a thread to pull upon to try and understand God. But of course, we want to reach Allah and his essence. That's our aim. One of the qualities of Allah is adl, is justice. In fact, this is one of the usul ad-din which we have. And it only became one of the usul of the five because of a series of intense debates between the Ash'arite and Mu'tazili about Allah Azza wa Jal, about free will, about predestination, about qada, about qadr, jabr, ikhtiyar. That debate in understanding how Allah is free was so extensive and so influential in our history that adl became a core usul in our aqidah, in our aqaid, in our theology, because of the extent of those debates. So now we have Tawheed, adl, nabuwwat, imamat, and ma'ad. The same thing happened with imamat, by the way. The people who did inkar against the wilayat of Imam Ali alayhi salam, it's because of all of the answering of those doubts and answering of those disagreements that we have imamat as such a defined concept. Adl is a very defined concept in the religion and especially in the tradition of Ahl al-Bayt. And that's why letter 53, which we're looking at, has this theme of justice as its core. The idea that when Imam Ali is sending Malik al-Ashtar to Egypt, he needs to govern, he needs to rule. Muhammad bin Abi Bakr cannot rule at the moment. There have been many people before him, many of them have done a lot of dhulm as well. And Imam sends Malik with a very express and key mission, which is to establish justice in this land. You are my representative. And of course, Imam Ali has such a beautiful relationship with Malik al-Ashtar. From the moment he begins being his companion to the end of his life, we see this love. For example, in the beginning, he says that, he has a hadith which is similar to saying that Malik is to me as I was to the Holy Prophet in terms of closeness and, the way he supported him. And when he dies, when Malik is killed and is shaheed of the Siffin, Imam Ali Islam says that as if, even though he has been killed, I have become lifeless as a result of this. If Malik was a rock, he was the hardest rock. If he was a stone, he was the firmest stone. Women would be barren before they give birth to another child like Malik. Like that's how close he is to him. So when he sends this letter to Malik, is the letters of someone who trusts his deputy entirely. Why? To establish justice. And that's why so many of the themes which come out are ones which are direct instructions to Malik. Malik, do this, do this, do this. Yani an imam is guiding him, who himself gets his authority from Allah. And he wants his deputy to establish justice in the same way his role is to establish justice. So it's a very important document. Okay. It's a very famous letter. It's a very famous letter. We are told that George Jordak, the famous Christian thinker, found it very influential in the way he described Imam Ali al-Islam and the concept of justice in his book Ali, The Voice of Human Justice. Similarly, the United Nations have also accepted this document. And I don't remember exactly which body, there are different reports, but it is framed in one of the UN buildings as a sign of the theories of government and justice of Ali ibn Abi Talib for all non-Muslims to appreciate. And it is long letter. That's why I was almost regretting setting such a long reading. But we will not go through all of it today. I will give a very brief summary of what this letter is, and then we will go through the first section of it, which establishes what is justice in the eyes of Ali ibn Abi Talib, what is adl, and why is it important that we implement adl today. And one motivation to all of you, inshallah, is that when someone asks you, tell me about Nahjal Balagha, you have this book, tell me about it, we might mention a few phrases. For example, a person is either your brother in faith or equal in humanity. We should know the context of that saying. It wasn't just said in isolation. There was a bit after and a bit before. We should know it if I'm going to quote it. And similarly, if someone says, okay, you have this book, Nahjal Balagha, give to me a saying or letter which is famous. Usually we'll say, well, the most famous letter is a letter to Malik al-Ashtar. Well, we should read it to know what's in it when we recommend it to others. So I hope, inshallah, for those of you who have attended today's book club, or those of you who are listening and are going to come next week, inshallah, you read it directly. You give yourself some time to read this letter to see what the Imam is actually saying. What does the Imam genuinely want us to believe? And what did he write to Malik, which exists now, that now when I recommend this letter to someone as a proof of Imam Ali salam, as a proof of his adl, I know what's in that letter. So inshallah, we can use this for our own personal journeys. Okay, this letter, it's a long letter. There are three main parts to the letter of Imam Ali salam to an order to Malik al-Ashtar. If you have it in front of you, inshallah, the online version of letter 53, or you have the hard copy, you can read it alongside as I'm describing. The first part of this letter describes the concept of adl and justice as coming from Allah, and the idea that establishing qist on this earth, establishing justice, is an obligation for every subsequent ruler to do, because it is the rule of Allah, the hukm of Allah. And the Imam is saying that I, the Imam, you, Malik, the deputy, and those under you, and those under you, we are all part of the same process. We're all part of the same process of establishing justice. Okay. Just to whoever is co-host with me, can you please admit people into the room, as I'm currently giving the lecture? So inshallah, if you are co-hosting, please, from Al-Noor, admit people in as we're speaking. Okay, so that's the first part. The first part is qist, comes from Allah. What is justice? In the second part of this letter of Imam Ali and Nahjal Balagha, he gives examples of 6 or 7 actually different groups. Each one, he instructs Malik exactly how to administer justice for them. So for him, he wants Malik to be very specific in the administering of justice. For example, the first of those group is the army. And he's telling Malik that the army, make sure you give them a good commander, make sure you are respecting them, make sure you're understanding the families where the army is coming from, make sure that you are not considering any of their affairs as little, for indeed they are large. So he's specifying the army. Then the second group who he specifies is the chief judge. So the one who is administering and listening to people's disagreements and i'tifaq, there should be somebody who is able to issue judgment precisely. So he's saying, Ya Malik, choose a judge who has the capacity to ponder on these issues and be firm in his judgment and to be fair. The third group who he instructs Malik to teach in terms of justice is the officers of the state. So these are people whose role is to be the executives, to be part of the state, but in order to administer the rule of law or the rules of Islam which are being established in this land. How should they act? How should they not act? What qualities are important to them? Which qualities are not important to them? Okay. The fourth of these groups is the administration and the administrators of revenue. These are those people in Egypt whose role it is to govern different provinces and pieces of land and collect the revenue from those places and return it back to the central government and the Bayt al-Mal, the public treasury. The Imam wants Malik to instruct them very precisely on how to administer the levying of taxes and how to collect those taxes in a way according to Islam and how to treat the people whose job it is to establish revenue. The fifth group is the clerical establishment. Now, this means not just ulama in terms of clerical, but it means administrative establishment of people whose role it is to be as if they are secretaries of the state. So each of them may be in charge of a different affair. Today we might call them ministers, like Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Ships, Minister of Home Affairs. Like they all have their own role. How should they act? And in the ideal state of the Imam Ali alayhi salam, how should the one who's responsible for a different department deal with different matters? This is the fifth of those points, of the 7 points. The sixth group the Imam tells Malik to issue in terms of how they should act are people who are traders and industrialists. So the Imam says either they are those who own markets or they own fixed areas of commerce or they are traveling salesmen. Because in those days people would travel far and wide for the reason of selling and for the purpose of trade. And they would actually be establishing the ummah and growing it just by trading with new and distant commercial partners. The Imam wants Malik to give a specific order on how they should act, how they should gather their income, how they should use and weigh their goods, what services they should and shouldn't provide. There is justice for them too. And the seventh group of them, which is one of the most important, is the lower classes, yani those who are poor, those who are destitute, those who might be having disabilities, those who might be begging, meaning people with disabilities who are also begging, those who might be yatim, those who might be widows. How should the ruler treat them? What are the huquq of the most poor, of those who are in the most difficult situations? What are the obligations of the ruler on those who no one else is helping? And why is it important, the Imam discusses, that there's a segment of funds from the Bayt al-Mal, the public treasury, which is designated exactly for this group, for the people who are poor. Why is that so important? Imam goes through them. So that's the second part of this speech, the 7 different groups on whom the Imam gives very specific examples of how to administer justice. But he establishes the idea of justice where? In the first part. And then after this, the Imam speaks about the third theme or the third segment of this letter is on the mentality of the ruler. So it's not just about justice, but it's about how should the ruler think? What should be their priority? How should they spend their time? If someone comes to you with an issue, Malik, how should you respond to them? How should you spend your time? Should you be with the people or secluded from the people? What part of your day should be with Allah and what part of your day should be with the people if you're going to rule? How should you behave? You know, like what should your general approach be in terms of access and in terms of speech? What issues should you speak about? Who should you assign responsibilities to? And when should you blame yourself for when things have gone wrong? If there's agreements you're making, how do you make those agreements? How do you make these treaties? Who do you make treaties with? What about war? How do you establish war? When do you not establish war? What about when people come to praise you? Who should be in your council? Who do you keep close to you? And who should you not allow close to you? What type of people should not gain access to you and power? The Imam then finishes by sending a dua to Malik, in which he actually includes Malik with himself in his own dua. So he would say, Allah, I give this min li wa huwa wa akhi, like for me and my brother, or for me and you. Li wa ilayk. And he includes Malik in his own dua, showing to all of us that the one who actually follows this letter and establishes rule the way the Imam wants us to, they become almost like a part of the Imam. They are part of his project, they are part of his mission. And indeed, as we're going to go through in the first part of this sermon, they are part of his mission of adl, that the Imam's adl is only complete after the adl of his deputies is complete. It's actually a very important lesson for every Shia, that when our Imam, inshallah, is going to return, وَقَدْ مَلَعْتُ الْأَرْضُ عَدْلًا, and he's going to, you know, establish adl on this earth. When we say the Imam establishes adl, a principle of Nahjal Balagha we have is it means he acts in a certain way and he delegates in a certain way. And if the Imam is delegating to Malik al-Ashtar and Malik is delegating to his executives and to his executives, ask yourself, to whom is my Imam delegating himself and his service and his project of adl? Where is the Malik of today? And if there's a Malik of today, where are the executives of that Malik today? We have an Imam right now who lives and who breathes and who has this project of adl. It's not the case that he'll only begin on his dhuhr. He's begun already. But how do we make ourselves a part of that? I don't think we'll have time to touch into this point of the Imam unless someone asks that question. But generally, I have given you a summary of the letter. And there are three parts, like I said. The part concerning what is qist and adl, which we're going to go through now. The second part concerning those 7 groups on whom the Imam tells Malik, this is how you establish justice for them. And the third group or the third section is about how the mentality of the ruler should be. Okay, if you have your copy of Nahjal Balagha open in front of you, inshallah, please open it now to look. Before I start, if anyone has any questions during the program as we're going, please feel free to write in the Zoom chat. If you're following on Facebook, please feel free to write in the Facebook message as a comment under the video, inshallah. To read along, if you've not yet got it, the link is now in the chat, so you can follow along. And similarly, if you want to speak or you want to make a point, please feel free to unmute your mic. It might be helpful if you raise your hand so then I can see and then I can ask you to unmute. But similarly, if I say, are there any questions and you want to ask, you can just unmute and you can speak. There's no problem, inshallah. No problem whatsoever. Or you can even take your video off and you can communicate directly. There is no problem, inshallah. But in any case, have this open. Before we start, are there any questions which anyone would like to ask about this letter before we begin? I see a question already, dear brother. Does the letter has all the details of the groups you have mentioned? Yes. So if you click on this link, inshallah, and you scroll down on the Al-Islam link to my sister, there is a section. I have mentioned where the sections end based on my reading. But when it says the exact section, it will say is... it will say is the different classes of people. When you get to the section of different classes of people, then you have number 1, the army, number 2, the chief judge. That is when the second section starts. So we are going to read up until that area of the different classes, inshallah. And then when that ends, there's a part of this letter which is called communion with Allah. That is when the third segment begins. I have made these segments for ease, but it's a good way to split it up. Does that make sense to you, inshallah, Sister Munira? Okay. There's another question which is, how can this letter help improve and relate to us if we don't, no, from Sister Munira, if we don't rule or have any power over anyone? A very good question, which I will come to. Actually, I'll say it now. We're looking at ruling and leadership, okay? The word for the ruler, one of the words is ray, okay? And the words for the people or the herd as a metaphor is rawiyya. You might think that this letter is to Malik al-Ashtar. He's going to lead in Egypt. He's the only leader and ruler. But our Holy Prophet Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that everyone is a ray and has their own rawiyya. Everyone is a ruler and has their own who they are ruling. And as we will see, ruling doesn't mean you have authority over them. Ruling means you are responsible for establishing justice for them. So for example, a man and woman have the responsibility of one another if they are married. of treating each other with respect to the other person's huquq, the other person's rights. Parents have this right to children, that they are their rawiyah, that they must treat them according to their justice and they're responsible for their well-being. If you are in a position of authority over anyone, whether in your workplace, these principles apply to you. If you are taking responsibility in the community and you are advising on how this community should run, and there are people who are responding to what you say, this applies to you because they are in some ways your rawiyah. So if Rasulullah has says everyone has their own rawiyah, ask yourself, to whom do I owe a responsibility to? Whose huquq do I have to maintain? So thank you, dear brother, for the question. This is a good way to look at this letter because none of us are going to become the governors of Egypt like Malik, but we are going to be the governors of something, whether it's our day or our lives or some people who we are in charge of. How should we act? Okay, I think that answers your question, inshallah. Alhamdulillah. Okay. Are there any more questions or any points anyone would like to make about this letter? Anyone want to raise their hand or unmute before we begin? Okay. So the letter begins, Rahim. So open up the letter 53 in front of you. هذا ما أمر به عند الله علي أمير المؤمنين مالك بن حارث al-Ashtar. This is the order, the hukm from Ali ibn Abi Talib to Malik al-Ashtar. في عهد إليه. In this instruction for him. حين وله مصر. As he's sending him to Misr, to Egypt. جبوت خراجها. First of all, collect the revenue. عدوها وجهاد عدوها, and fight against the enemy. واستسلاح أهلها, and seek good of its people. وإمارة بلادها, and make the city prosperous. This is a summary of everything that's going to come. Number 1, collect the revenue. Number 2, fight against the enemies. Number 3, do islah of the people if they have disagreements amongst them. And number 4, make the city prosperous. Make the bilad have wealth in it. Okay. But what is the origin, the methodology of the Imam? He continues in the beginning. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Amrahu, the order which has been given to you is bitaqwa Allah. Take taqwa from Allah Azza wa Jal. وإيثار طاعته واتباع ما أمر به في كتابه من فرائض وسنن التي لا يسعد أحد إلا باتباعها. First of all, your order is to fear Allah before everything. Have taqwa. And your order is to prefer His ita'ah over everything. And ittiba' ma amra ma fi kitabihi, and to make sure you are following everything which has been commanded in his book, that which is being ordered, fara'idh, and that which is the sunan, that is which is the commands which have come from tradition. التي لا يسعد أحد إلا باتباعها. You, if you do not follow this, you will not attain any of the virtue which is going to come later, inshallah. ولا يشقى إلا مع خدودها وإذاعتها. And neither are you going to benefit, or you are not going to achieve any virtue, and neither will you be safe from any evil by trying to oppose or ignore it, unless you do what? You have taqwa of Allah and listen to what is in this book. وَأَن يَنْصُرَ اللَّهُ سُبْحَانَهُ بِيَدِهِ وَقَلْبِهِ وَلِسَانِهِ. And you will try to help Allah with your heart, min qalbi, وَلِسَانِهِ, and your tongue. You will give yourself to Allah. فَإِنَّهُ جل اسمه قد تكفل بنصري من نصره. If you do this, Allah has promised He will help the one who tries to help Him, because His name is sublime and He takes responsibility for you. تكفل بنصره من نصره. He is taking responsibility of helping those who try to help Him. وإعزاز من عزه. And for protecting those who try to give support to His deen. وأمره أن يكسر نفسه عند الشهوات ويزعها عند الجماعات فإن النفس أمارة بالسوء إلا ما رحم الله. And Allah will help you and protect you if you do this. And He orders He will try and break your heart from any attachment to shahwat. He will help you in this task. And he'll restrain you at any moment where you are having this struggle, because the heart in the Jama'at, فَإِنَّ النَّفْسَ أَمَّارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ, this heart is leading towards following lowly desires, إِلَّا مَا رَحِمَ اللَّهِ, except to the mercy of Allah. Let's pause just for a second. The foundation of adl, the foundation of justice is taqwa. You begin by worshipping Allah Azza wa Jal. And the Imam is saying, you will not attain any of the virtues which are to follow unless you have this taqwa in you. You will not be able to. He says, even if you try to follow the other hukum which are going to come, you will fall short unless وَنَفْسَ نَصْرَ اللَّهِ, you are one who tries to help Allah. And if you do, if you begin with this foundation that I'm going to get my orders from Allah and get adl from Allah and qist from Allah, and I'm not going to try and compete with Allah, Allah will help you. Not only He will help you in your hukum and helping guiding you, He will يَكْسَبْ نَفْسُ عِنْدَ الشَّهْوَاتِ, He will break your heart away from desires. Because the thing which takes you away from adl is shahwat. It's desires. That I know something is right for me. I know this is something's haqq, but my desire wants something else. And the Imam sees this all around him. When that happens, the Imam is saying, if you turn to Allah, you will find yourself not wanting those shahwat. Allah will help you and cut your heart away from attachment to those things. All right. The reason why we begin like this, before I continue, and not with ideas of politics or the khulafa or anything like this, is because the adl which Imam Ali is trying to implement is the same mission he received from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And to understand why he begins like this, Shaykh Mutahari in his book Sayri Dar Nahjal Balagha turns to a few verses of Quran to understand exactly where Nahjal Balagha is able to comment on this idea of adl and politics. He starts off with Surah 57 verse 25. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. لقد أرسلنا رسولا بالبينات وأنزلنا معهم الكتاب والميزان ليقوم الناس بالقسط. Indeed, we have sent our messenger with clear proofs, bayinat, and with them he has sent down معهم الكتاب والميزان, the book and the balance, two separate things. Why? ليقوم الناس بالقسط, to establish amongst the people justice, or to administer justice. Allah reveals two separate phenomena which are linked in one aim, which is يقوم الناس بالقسط, to establish justice. One is kitab, one is mizan. One is the book, and the other is the balance of justice which will administer this justice. Already we are told that that mizan is, of course, the message of Allah in terms of the prophets and the awliya and awsiya. So adl comes from Allah, qist comes from Allah. We keep reading. We want to know exactly where the adl from Allah helps and the adl from Allah stops, and it begins from Rasulullah and carries on to Imam Ali alayhi salam. Ya ayyuha rasul, balligh ma unzila ilayka min rabbika. Many of you know of this verse, in which after the proclamation of Ghadir, which is coming inshallah, where we are told man kuntu mawla fahad Ali mawla. After that point, at that point, the Prophet is told, reveal everything that has come to you from your Lord min rabbika. وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلْ فَمَا بَلَّغَتْ لِرَسُولِكَ. If you do not, then you've not even delivered this message. وَاللَّهُ يَعْصِمُكَ مِنَ النَّاسِ. Allah Azza wa Jal is the one who will protect you from the people. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَهْدِي الْقَوْمَ الْكَافِرِينَ. Allah does not guide those who disbelieve. What's the beginning? يَا أَيُّهَا الرَّسُولُ بَلِّغْ مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ مِن رَبِّكَ. Convey everything which has come to you. One of our ulama says that includes the entire social project of the Prophet. Give it all to the wilayat of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Explain what that means. Meaning, the wilayat of the Imam alayhi salam comes from the prophethood of Rasulullah. And when he says, Man kuntu mawla fa'ada aliyin mawla, when that moment happens, al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum, the deen is complete, that means he's transferred all of it onto Imam Ali alayhi salam. One of which is لِيَقُومَ النَّاسَ بِالْقِسْطِ, to establish justice on this earth. The Imam needs to continue this project. And then we keep reading another example of this. Surah 3, Ali Imran, verse 144. If you remember the Battle of Uhud, where some people thought the Prophet has died, then this verse was revealed to explain that moment. وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولًا قَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِ الرَّسُولِ. Muhammad is just a prophet, just like those who have come before you. أَفَإِنْ مَاتَ أَوْ قَتِيلٌ أنقلبتم على أعقابكم. If it happens that he has been killed, that he's died or been killed, are you going to turn back on your heels? Are you going to leave everything behind? If you do, then you're not with Allah anymore. Meaning, if the Prophet dies, you need to continue what he has given to you. And what he's given to you is the obligation to establish justice. Through these three verses, we've understood why Imam Ali alayhi salam needs to establish justice on this earth. Because it came from Allah from the first verse. The Prophet who's responsible for this gives it to Imam Ali alayhi salam in his hukum that he's the Imam after him. And when the Prophet dies, it needs to continue because the Muslim told you can't just stop right now. You have to continue, meaning that the mission the Prophet started in Medina needs to continue in the establishing of politics. Here now, Shaykh Mutahri says, we are now able to understand why Imam Ali Islam is the Imam for whom we turn to when it comes to politics, because it's his job to establish justice from the book. That is how these verses are used. And Allama Tabatabai has the same opinion, that when looking at these verses, that when qist has been established, it needs to continue, and that social project must continue until it's finished. And that's the word of Imam Ali alayhi salam. Okay, we have a question from our sister Zahra. How will we help Allah? Could you please explain this? Okay, earlier in the section, the part of symbolism one, Nasr Allah, Ansur. Allah helps the one who helps him. So the question is, how do we help Allah? Allah desires justice on this earth. ليقوم الناس بالقسط. And he has sent down the Mizan and the Kitab for this reason. Anyone who acts to establish justice on this earth is helping this mission. They're not helping Allah. They're helping the plan of Allah to be implemented. So that Allah is saying, the Imam is saying, if you help God in the establishing of justice, Allah will help you in being a tool of that justice. Does that make sense, sister? So it's not about helping Allah, it's about helping the mission of Allah of justice as seen in the first verse. Thank you so much. If it's not clear, then I'm happy to explain further from my understanding and what the ulama have commented on this section. Okay, are there any other questions, by the way, about this so far? Anyone want to ask anything? All right. Are there any hands raised? No, fine. So we begin by saying justice comes from God. It went to the Prophet, it comes to the Imam. Imam Ali al-Islam has justice, is his job, and he's now entrusting it to Malik to continue establishing that same qist for which he had been told it was his purpose on the day of Ghadir. We continue. The Imam then speaks about Malik and where he's being sent. He says to him, "Oh Malik, I have sent you to an area where there have been governments before you. And those governments were not all the same. Amongst them, min adlin wa jur. Some of them had justice, certainly, but some of them were oppressive. Both. People will now watch your dealings as you used to watch the dealings of the rulers before you. They will criticize you, just like you criticize rulers who you disagreed with. Surely those who are virtuous are known by their reputation. Allah circulates for them through the tongues of his creatures." Meaning, if a person has virtue, it's known because people speak favorably about them. Therefore, Ya Malik, he's saying, the best thing you can collect with you is amal, is deeds. Collect these deeds. Control your passions and check your heart. And then he says, from doing that which is not lawful to you. Because checking the heart, to have check of this qalb, means detaining it just halfway between what it likes and dislikes. All right, let's take a pause right there. Malik needs to be the example which the people are going to follow. It can't be, and it's not allowed to be, that Malik can act in a certain way and the people are already used to adl and jawr. They're used to good and bad. They need to identify Malik as one of the two. And so the Imam is saying to them, bear in mind, Malik, you're going to a place where people are used to both. Khair and qub, good and bad. They've seen both in front of them in this very same land. Of course, remember, Egypt is where Ziyad has also led. And Egypt is the same place where the Holy Prophet sent one of the first few muhajirs to. Meaning it has seen both the Islam of Rasulullah and the so-called Islam of Banu Umayyah. It's seen both in its government. And now it's seeing Malik. The people need to realize what kind of person is Malik al-Ashtar. So the Imam is saying, you need to regulate your heart from its shahwat. So when the people look to you, they then have an example. And then continues. وَأَشْعِرْ قَلْبَهُ الرَّحْمَةِ بِالرَّعِيَّةِ. Make sure that you make your heart merciful to those who are ra'iyya, those who you are in control of, those who are your subjects. Have affection and karam for them. وَالْمُحَبَّ لَهُمْ. Have muhabbat for them as well. Don't stand over them like greedy beasts who feel it's enough that they're going to be devoured, meaning don't scare them. Since Malik, they are of two kinds. Either they are your brothers in faith or they are your equals in humanity. Remember this, Malik. So this is the context of that famous phrase. People are either your brothers in faith or equal in humanity. They are أخ لك في الدين أو أما نظير لك في الخلق. They are either your brothers, your akh in deen, they have the same deen as you, or they are at the very least your equals in humanity. What did he say just before this? Don't be a beast to them. Don't be an animal to them, because they are either your brothers in faith or your equal in humanity. They are going to make mistakes. They're going to commit slips. They may act wrongfully. They may act willingly or by neglect. And so have rahm and karam on them. Have mercy and have forgiveness for them. In the same way you would like Allah to have forgiveness and mercy on you. That's how you should treat with them. Because Malik, you are over them. You are above them. And that means it's your responsibility to have this, because I am over you. In fact, he says, فَإِنَّكَ فَوْقَهُمْ. You are above them. وَإِلَىٰ أَمْرِ عَلَيْكَ فَوْقَكَ. And your imam is upon you, يعني me. وَاللَّهُ فَوْقَ مَنْ وَلَكَ. And Allah is above both of us. Allah is above this whole system. وقد تكفك أمرهم. And this affair, this amr which has been established, is upon both of us, you and me. And he sought you to manage this for Allah. And so he has tried you with your people. Okay. Now we have the context for a person is either your brother in faith or your equal in humanity. We have the context. And the context is when a person is ruling over someone who is different to them, but they are responsible for them. You need to recognize that you, them, the one who gave you an order, and the one who gave him an order are all under the same thing, which is qist, which is justice and the obligation of justice. No one is better than one another. We are all equals in this regard. Imam is saying, even me and you, Malik, are equal in our humanity, that we are both equal as people. But just like you are fawqa, you are above them, and I'm above you. And just like I'm above you, Allah is above both of us. So be mindful of your duty, mindful of your obligation. Okay. Here, I would like to ask all of you a question. Okay? I'm taking a glass of water. I've been speaking a lot. Okay. This phrase, let's stop for a second and think about it. A person is either your brother in faith, let's say sibling in faith, because it can be applied differently, your sibling in faith or your equal in humanity. When you use this phrase or you think of this phrase, how do you think it applies to living in the West? We know the context of Malik in Egypt. I get it. He's in charge. He's ruling over them. How do you think this idea that a person is either your brother in faith or equal in humanity applies to Muslims living in the West? If you can write in the chat your ideas, please do. If you'd like to unmute, you can unmute. You can raise your hand. I don't mind, inshallah, and mention your points. What do we think? So the question again is, to encourage you, a person is either your brother in faith or your equal in humanity. How do you think this applies to us in the West? We who are Muslims living in the West. How does it apply to us? What do we think? And by the way, if you're watching on Facebook, someone inshallah will copy your comments and paste it in the chat. But those of you who are here, please do. I encourage you, write down what you think. How do we apply this in our lives? Can you think of any examples in your lives where it has helped you in dealing with non-Muslims? Does it help you see people differently? Does it help you see non-Muslims differently? What do we think? So I'm getting a few comments coming in. One is we should treat people equally. and give everyone a fair chance for opportunities and not discriminate. Good. So here we're recognizing the humanity in somebody, and we should treat people equally because, as the sister has written in a direct message, because it gives everyone a fair chance. Actually, do you know why this is a really good idea? Because we are giving them an opportunity to show us the best in them, right? Like we're not judging them immediately. We're giving them a chance to reveal what's in their heart. In another part in Nahjal Balagha, the Imam says that don't judge people now. The time for knowing them and judging them is haddul akhir al maut, at the time when they're about to die. Because at that time, you know what was in their heart. Until then, you just don't know. So treat them and give them the benefit of the doubt. And here we have a really good example from the dear sister that you give everyone equal opportunity and don't discriminate between them because you just don't know what they believe, what they're going to say, and what their mentality is. So good. Recognizing the humanity gives us equality. There's been another comment here as well, which is we should respect their religion and be equal with them. This is a good comment as well from another sister. We should respect their religion, respect their deen, because even if we don't have the same deen, because the word deen is religion is used, we have something else in common, which is humanity. In fact, when the Imam, the first day he becomes the Khalifa after all this time, he says, Saluni, Saluni, qabla an tafqaduni, ask me before you lose me. He says this famous lines, he says it many times. And then later he says, if a Jewish person comes to me, I will judge them according to their book better than they know that their own book. And if a Christian comes to me, I'll judge them based on their book better than they know their own book. Meaning he would establish adl for all of them based on their own deen. This is only possible, this idea of Islam accepting and recognizing other religions with this mentality that a person might not be my equal in religion, but they are my equal in deen. And I should not say they're a sinner or they are an evil person if they're doing something different, because they are following their own deen and they should be judged according to their deen. This doesn't mean adl does not apply to them. It just helps me see the person and understand why they are doing certain actions. They will still be answerable for their deeds like I am answerable for my deeds. But we're in a multi-faith society. Someone has written, as we live in a multi-faith society, like I just said, with neighborhood of various ethnicities, we need to treat them with equality. That's right. In the UK, where I am, maybe some of you are in other parts of England or other parts of the world, or in the West, maybe America, Canada, or wherever you are listening. I know that we have some listeners to the Monthly Reflections podcast in the Middle East and in Pakistan as well. So if you're listening later on, inshallah, think about this point. We live in a society right now which is not an Islamic society. There are different cultures and faiths here. We need to look at them in a way in which we're not judging them and thinking negatively of them to the extent where we're saying everyone's going to hell. That's not helpful, and it's not even how the Imam looks at people. His primary way of looking at them is either you're my equal, you're my brother in faith, in which case we have an Islamic consensus, or my equal in humanity. This helps seeing our neighbors so much more. So that's a great point by the brother. There's another comment here. To not be racist, but fair and just. That's right. So if there are some ideas, some qualities which are developing, which are in contrary to what the Imam wants, this saying and this sentiment helps root them out. For example, racism. How can I be racist to someone if I see them as my equal in humanity, as we are one in our khalq? I will not even see the distinctions as having any value. Okay, we might have different cultural backgrounds, historical backgrounds, ethnicities, pigmentation, but we do not assign any value to these in terms of difference between us. They don't mean anything in terms of our humanity. Here's the example given by the Imam, that Malik, when you're above them, be kind to all of them, be merciful to all of them. And why is it universal? Just like you want Allah to be merciful to you, be merciful to them. That's a very universal type of dua. That's Ya Allah, or I'm saying, oh God, be merciful to me like I'm being merciful to the people. That's a very general, broad. There's no praise for discrimination there. So that's a very good point by the sister. And she's added to that as well, respecting each other's beliefs, since in the West, there's a multi-faith practice of beliefs and culture. Exactly. We're able to respect each other's beliefs. Not just respect. Sometimes we can learn from each other's beliefs. It's not the case that just because someone is of the same deen as me, they're the only person I take ilm from. I can take ilm from anyone. I can go to China, I can go to anyone for the sake of ilm. And if I find in other people who are not Muslim good advice and good conduct, especially, for example, in Christians, in the interfaith work that we do, I should take it because I recognize from the beginning that we share humanity. and maybe your perspective can help me look at my issues a little bit differently. So that's a very good point by the sister. Sister Munir has written, hang on a second. That so when we were discussing about how treating people differently, there was the idea that people who are underprivileged, like old people, are treated differently in the West, like deduction of national insurance. It's a really, it's a good example for recognizing the differences amongst people and treating them differently. Because a part of adl is giving everything its appropriate place. In fact, in one saying of the Imam, saying 437, someone said to him, which of the two is better? Adl or generosity? And the Imam says, adl means to put everything in its proper place, whereas generosity means to take it out from its place. So adl means outfit for a good reason. Adl means to give everything according to its huquq. And that means you treat people differently. So when Imam is talking to Malik, he's telling them, when you're with the poor, be kind with them, treat them like this. And when you're with those who have privilege, treat them like this. Everyone has their own huquq. I'll come back to this saying later, but let me go through the comments. Sister Shabana has written, we should respect everyone regards to their culture, religion, and faith. We can't judge others. Allah is there to judge them. We find good in others to bring closer to one another. Hassan, this is a very beautiful point. We don't just have respect for them, but we also look for the good in them. Like we are actively looking for that good. This is one of the qualities of the Shias of Ali ibn Abi Talib, that they look for good in others. Why? Because they are wanting that same goodness from Allah. We have one hadith, Inna Allah ta'ala jamilun yuhibbul jamal. Allah is beauty and He loves beauty. So the people are naturally want to be close to that which is beautiful. And maybe you will find beauty in the sayings and teachings of other religions or other faiths. There's no obligation against learning from them. And by recognizing their humanity, we learn from them. In fact, in another part of Nahjal Balagha, the Imam says that I have studied the ways of those who have come before me. I have reflected on the lives of those who have died before my coming. I've learned from their mistakes. And so the idea of learning from others before us, before the Imam, of course, there was no Islam of the Rasulullah. There were other people. So I've learned from them. The Imam sometimes compliments poets and sha'ar who are non-Muslim, like before the advent of Islam, just for the sake of their poetry, just to learn from them. It's very normal to appreciate goodness from others. Islam wants us to be like this. So that's a very nice point from Sister Shabana. There's a question here which is, are the positions of being sibling in faith and an equal in humanity themselves equal? I'm not sure what that question means of are the positions equal. If inshallah you can comment again to explain what that means, I'll be happy to explain that. There's another comment which is loving others from Agha Shahzad is a prerogative to wisdom, and loving your neighbor is the path towards right knowledge. This is a nice saying. Is this a hadith? Because it was phrased in a very beautiful way. Agha Shahzad, is it a hadith or is it a saying, or did you write it yourself? Because certainly it's very poetic. I'll read it out again. It's a personal reflection, very beautiful. Let me read it for those who are not reading it. Loving others is a prerogative to wisdom, and loving your neighbor is the path towards right knowledge. So if I break it down, loving others is part of gaining hikmah. Yeah, we mentioned here that muhabba, you need to have muhabba for those who are your ra'i, he says to Malik. And this is to be a wise leader, to have muhabbat. So certainly love and wisdom are linked. And loving your neighbor is a path towards right knowledge. Yeah, loving your neighbor, muhabbat for your jar is good. As Sayyidina Fatima says, awwal al-jar thumma ad-dar. First your neighbors and then yourselves. She does dua for her neighbors and then she does dua for herself, said the Fatima sallallahu alayha. To the extent where her son says to her, I think it's Imam al-Hassan, my mother, you have spent this long, long night in dua, this whole night in dua. For whom did you pray for? Or what did you pray for? And she says, I didn't pray for myself at all. First the neighbors and then us. First those around us. Question to all of you. We want to follow this. We want to be like this, right? Were, say, the Fatima sallallahu alayhi has neighbors, the best neighbors? No, amongst them were people who were evil. Are our neighbors all Muslim and Shi'i and in our mosques? No, we have neighbors who are from different religions. Still, we should do dua for them. Still, we should pray for them. In the huquq of the neighbors, of those who are near and who are far. From Imam Sajjad in Risalat al-Huquq, he says that there are some rulings for your neighbors based on geographical location. How near are they to you? And then there are some obligations for neighbors who are close to you and they are believers. These are Don't think that we have to just love the believers who are close to us, literally the people who are close to us. And we're not going to have that love for them unless we understand that they are at least our equals in humanity, if not our brothers in faith. So the brother who wrote the question about brothers in faith, equal humanity being the same thing, please comment again what you mean by that, inshallah. I'll be able to give you my thoughts, if I have any. Was there anyone who'd like to unmute or make a comment here or a question on this point? Feel free to, inshallah. You can raise your hand or you can just unmute immediately if there's anything that you'd like to add. And also to whoever's in the office, to Ali or to Irshad, please check if there's any comments on Facebook that on this point, and we can answer. Someone has written, I thought you can't do dua of forgiveness for munafiqeen. If that's true, that's for those who are munafiqeen. Here we're talking in a general way. So this saying is is for those who are in general, either brothers in faith or equal in humanity. It's not specifically for adu. The way you treat enemies has a very different ruling, which comes later in the sermon. Okay? If that's the question about whether these things are the same, this is a general principle. It is not a principle to apply to an enemy once you know they are hurting you. To say, well, because I'm equal in humanity, I'm not going to fight against you and I should be apathetic. No, we still have jihad, as the Imam says to Malik in the beginning, but this is a general principle for governance. There's a question from Sister Nadine on Facebook, which is, if we look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we can cultivate allies from our non-Muslim brothers and sisters who also support for the self-redetermination of Palestinians, because it's a human rights issue ultimately. A beautiful point. Beautiful point. This issue of Israel and Palestine, this political issue, I really wanted to, later on in the sermon, we can discuss politics more, because the Imam gives explicit guidance of how to make political stances. So we're not there yet, but I'll give the point now. If there are political issues we need allies. It is in the nature of our tradition to seek to find friends in common causes and to fight against the enemies of our friends. This is the principle which is established. And so in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, Al-Quds is not the only day where people march for Palestine. There are some days that Christians march for Palestine, some days that the anti-war coalition march for Palestine, some days that political parties march for Palestine. All of them are having the same aim. They're having the same goal. If I recognize that we are equal in humanity, that helps us to build coalitions and bridges amongst one another to march together. Because we can make more of an impact if we are united. And indeed, later on in the sermon, later on in this letter to Malik al-Ashtar, the Imam mentions the rights of the judge and the rights of the officers. And one amongst them, they are the rights of treating people correctly and giving the right people the right maqams in governance. Who should not be in power? Who should be in which position? And indeed, if there's someone who's going to be in a position of power in our society who can help us, it is in our interest to support them more than the person who will act against us. Now, how we make those stances and the methodology of taking political stances, as I said, comes later. But it's very good to mention now, and I thank Sister Nadine for making it at this point. Good. Are there any other points at the moment that we wanted to go through about what we've said so far?
I just wanted to say, Brother Farshuri, thank you very much for this comment. These very useful. The point is, Imam Ali alayhi salam in his book Nahjal, he does, there's sometimes when you read it, you feel like he's quite a strong, staunch opponent of justice. Well, he's promoting justice to the extent that he almost vilifies people to uncomfortableness. But this whole sermon itself kind of highlights his whole nature of mercy and love and appreciation. So you should take that as a stance that Imam Ali wasn't the person that always tells people not to do things. He was actually quite forthcoming with this soft-hearted approach. So I feel like that kind of emphasizes his duality in a way. There is a nature about him which you can't put into words, but the essence is there because he kind of doesn't hold back on his love and mercy to the extent that he's making that as a paramount point to one of his governors. That's very crucial because a lot of the Nahjal Balagha is quite, he's saying things against certain people to the extent that he's almost hurt from them. But his mercy overcomes. Do you know what I mean? That's the sentiments that I feel from the book as well.
Yeah.
There is that feeling.
I agree. This is such a good point because bear in mind that Nahj Balagha contains the sermon speeches of a very specific time in his life when he's Khalifa, most of them. In fact, all of them actually. He speaks about times before, but they're actually from that time. This is a hard time in his life. He's been through, three khulafa before him who usurped his rights. He's been through all of the fitna which followed the death of the Holy Prophet. He has he has literally living in a time of oppression and dhulm around him. The hadith from Nahj Balagha are different in character to those from other collections because of this point which you highlight, where he's actually spending so much time opposing dhulm, he doesn't have as much space to establish qist. And when he does establish justice, he faces opposition where they say, why are you establishing justice in this situation? Why not fight the enemies? He's in a really hard position. But in Egypt, he sees potential. Really great point, Shahzad. Agha Shahzad. He sees potential where he thinks that if Malik follows what he's saying, Egypt can become a real source of goodness. And indeed, the love for Ahl al-Bayt in the land of Misr, of Egypt, is something which is renowned. Really, even after this time in the Fatimid time, and even after this in the positive relations between the students of Egypt and the scholars of Ahl al-Bayt. There is a good spirit, especially in Al-Azhar in recent times. Not to say there's disagreements. For example, the martyrdom of Sheikh Shahad, that we have issues, of course we do. But Egypt has always been this place where you'll find the teachings of Ahl al-Bayt, especially Nahj Balagha as well. There are ulama from Al-Azhar University in Egypt who have promoted and translated Nahj Balagha to a much greater extent than Muslim countries, other Muslim countries. And so maybe the Imam sees Egypt as a good opportunity to establish himself. On the point you mentioned, it reminds me of a part of Sermon 15, which is not really what we're looking at today. But there's a time when the Imam is going through the lands which have previously been taken by Uthman before him, and the Imam is now giving it back to the people. Okay, so previously, the land was appropriated and given to different people in Banu Umayyah as nepotism, meaning to reward them for being close to the family. Imam's not like that. He takes the land back, gets the revenue, and gives it back to the people. So the people come to him and they say to him, Ya Imam, okay, this is all nice, but why don't you, focus on the enemy who's Muawiyah? You have to fight a war. Why are you spending so much time distributing assets and resources and wealth? Like, we have to fight a war. The Imam says, by Allah, even if I had found such money from these different land grabs and women who had been married and made slaves from this money and purchased, I would have freed those women and returned them back to their owners. Why? Because there's a wide scope of justice. فَإِنَّ فِي عَدْلٍ سَاعَةً. This is the time of justice now. وَمَنْ ضَاقَ عَلَيْهِ الْعَدْلِ. And the one who finds it hard to act with justice with adl, فَالْجَوْرِ عَلَيْهِ عَسِيقٌ. There are someone who will find it very hard to deal with injustice. Meaning, now is the time. And when is now? Any time you have the chance for justice, you establish it. Not what the people say, but what Allah wants from you. So one of the reasons why Imam's tone is like this is because he is prepared to focus on justice and adl, even when those around him are telling him to focus on different things. The Imam is fixed on this idea. Everything has its own rightful place. And the role of the Imam is to put it in its rightful place. There's a question here from Sister Zahra, brother. So inshallah, I hope that makes your point, inshallah. If not, you can always add something later, definitely. Zahra says, brother, in the letter it says, Allah circulates your reputation. Does this mean if we hear a bad rep about ourselves, meaning reputation, we can assume it's coming from Allah? No. No, because there were even bad reputations about the Imam alayhi salam. People said, when there was the time when Imam alayhi salam, his head was struck, people said, Ali prays. Like, it was strange to them to hear that Ali ibn Talib would even pray, because the reputation going around about him and the la'an of him was so negative that they thought incorrectly from them. So it is not the case that what people say about you defines you. When you are in power, what the people say about you does define your reputation. If you act out of goodness and adl when you're in that position of power, and the people respond to you in a positive way, meaning that they are also responding to you, then Imam is saying you get a good reputation, and Allah will help you in that task. But as you have just mentioned, there can be an example where the people are cursing the leader or are having a bad reputation. That's not from Allah. That's from them. That's from their shahawat, from their nafs, like we mentioned earlier. A good reputation is from Allah, And a bad reputation of a good ruler is from fitna, is from the people. I hope that establishes that difference. So to make it clear, if a ruler is good and acts out of adl, and he has a good reputation, Allah helped him in that. If a person is bad, is negative, and a bad reputation, that's from them. If a person is a good ruler and they are a good and positive ruler, like Ali alayhi salam, but the people are opposing him for other reasons, that's from those other reasons, not from Allah. Like there's a difference in them. Yeah, if that's not clear, then you inshallah you can ask against the Zahra. But Allah gives good reputation to good rulers. Okay. I wanted to make a point about this idea about how non-Muslims react to us and how this sermon helps us in dealing with non-Muslims. It's a final point I'll make, and it's from Ayat al-Mutahari in commenting on this section of Nahjal Balagha. You guys see now why I had to split it into segments, because there was no way we were getting through the whole letter in just one discussion. Shaykh Mutahari says, the reason why it was important for Imam Ali alayhi salam to tell Malik that people will not necessarily love you unless you love them and show them mercy, and that they have had different rulers and you need to act with justice to them, is because of how we make judgments in our mind. He says all people establish what is known as a hierarchy of values. This means all of us have ideas which are important to us. And these come from certain premises or axioms which are popular in our society. So if there's an idea which is in a society which is quite well known and we believe in it, we then take those ideas and formulate from it values. He gives a few examples. He says, in the West, race is a premise which exists, an idea which exists, and that leads to the values of racism being in the hierarchy of ideas. Okay. Nepotism exists, where people give power to each other based on how close they are to them and not necessarily their capability. For that reason, we have a corrupt political system. He says, chastity of females does not exist in the West. So that means they don't have an existing idea of the modesty of women. Why? Not because they are bad people, because they didn't use the right value, the right premise for their judgment. If they had that value, they would have a very different conclusion. If you take out one component of the argument and put in another value, the conclusion would be different. Shaykh Mutahri says, this sermon, this letter proves to us Islam comes to overturn the value system of other systems. Because Islam has its own values, like qist and adl, like justice, or in the case of that, like the haya of women, for example, and other concepts, not just hijab, many concepts. And Islam changes the values which are important and changes the value which you give to different ideas. It reduces the value of race and increases the value of taqwa. So the Islamic system looks different in character to the materialistic system. They come from different places. And that's why it's important for the ruler in the Muslim time to have an act out of adl themselves. Like they need to embody this idea. They can't just expect people to know about it, because the people have developed values based on different premises which were not the same as yours. So the follower of Ali alayhi salam needs to have the same values of Ali ibn Abi Talib in order for the other person to look at them and think of Ali. Do you see like the priority? And here's why it's important for us in the West, because in the West, the values which exist come from very different places. They come from the period of Renaissance, they come from the Enlightenment, they come from liberalism, they come from imperialism, they come from all these ideas inherent to the development of Western thought, which are not the same as Islam. Their whole sources of knowledge, their epistemology is not Quran, it's not Hadith. They don't know the Imams in order to use them for their judgments, but they know Rousseau, they know Locke, they know Hume, they know Descartes, they know Kant, they know these thinkers, and it's from their ideas that they now develop certain theories. Ayat Tahri goes even further and gives us exact examples of why the people need to be spoken to in this way from this letter. He says, in the West, there was this idea of splitting the church from the state. This came from the Enlightenment, which came from the period of the French Revolution, in which for the first time in the West, the church was no longer in charge of the state. Okay. When this happened, Mu'adh Mutahri says, they took spirituality away from politics. There's no need for the government to have religion or spirituality. Then thinkers like Rousseau and thinkers like Hobbes, by the way, I recently wrote a 6,000 word essay on Hobbes about 2 weeks ago. So when I've used this word, I'm thinking of all of those things and it's fresh in my mind. These thinkers then came back and they decided to give the power of spirituality and religion to the kings. And they said, the king is the one who has authority over the people. And whatever he says is law, not just law. Whatever the king says is moral, it's right, because the king was appointed by God. No, like the church is no longer the thing which is giving power, but the king and his word becomes law. This means that if the king says slavery is allowed, slavery becomes moral, it becomes good. It becomes something which is righteous because the king has said it. If the king says we should have colonialism, where we go and invade countries like India and Iran and Persia and North Africa and establish our rule over them from the West, not only is that allowed, that becomes moral because the king has said it. This idea, which is known as legal positivism, means that qist and adl cannot exist amongst the people in a democracy. It can't exist because it only applies to the ruler. Whereas in Islam, adl is an obligation on the ruler and the ruled. You see the difference? It's not just the ruler who chooses what's right and wrong. God chooses what's right and wrong. And both the one who is being ruled and the ruler have to follow God. Now, you have to be moral. You have to. Not because of who you are, what your maqam is. It doesn't matter. It's because of what is written in the book and what's written in the words of the Imams. This new obligation means that you restructure your entire value system. Now, you get your premises from Ahl al-Bayt. For example, have love for your neighbors. Be kind to the poor. Speak the truth. Kalimatul adl is better than 1,000 years of worship, for example. Like, these are your new principles. Now you have a new value system. A system like, I want to establish justice on this earth. A system like, a person is either your brother in faith or equal in humanity. A system like, from Abu Abdullah, hayhat min dhillah. I would rather live, I'd rather prefer a death than a life of disgrace and humiliation. We can only take these stances once we have the right principles. And we get these principles from Quran, Ahlul Bayt, and all of these things. And by the way, even if we had no Quran and Ahlul Bayt, we would still be able to know what's right and wrong based on our aql, based on our reason, because of the principle of husn wa qub aqli, that right and wrong are things which are rationally known. But what we don't do is we don't say just because someone's in power, what they say is true. Just because this government is powerful, we have to listen and think they are moral. Just because everyone is following one leader, doesn't mean I have to follow that leader as well, in my heart at least. No, I go to somewhere else for qist, for adl. This is so important. And so Ayatollah Tahri's conclusion for this part, I'll make it the conclusion for our discussion, is that the obligation for adl applies to all people. And Imam Ali sends Malik to remind the people that there is an Allah who believes in justice for all of them. The army, the chief judge, the administrators, the clerical establishments, and those who are poor, all of them. And the ruler must be able to speak to each and every group according to their rights, according to the huquq, and administer it specifically. And that's why in next week's discussion on Nahjal Balagha and next week's book club on Wednesdays, we are going to look at the next part of this letter, in which the Imam establishes 6 different groups and establishes what is the adl for each group. What is the adl for those in the army, those who are judges, those who are executives, those who are business people, those who are in the establishment, and those who are poor. How should the leader treat every single one of them? And when we look at how the leader should treat those who are poor, especially those who are musta'adaf, those who are weak, those who are orphans, those who are homeless, those who are refugees. We will then start to link this to our society. How should we act in our with our destitute, how the Imam wants us to act. Okay, so that is next week, inshallah. We will look at the rest of letter 53. If you have the copy in front of you, inshallah, we have read somewhere up until this point. Keep reading from the different classes of people until the area of the communion with Allah. You can read to the end if you wish, which will be the bit after, but at least read that part of these 6 different groups and how the Imam wants us to act with them. Okay, I will stop. Are there any questions? Is anything not clear? Please mention it now, inshallah, and I can clear it up for next week. Are there any points about today which you'd like me to expand upon now very quickly? Or any questions in general that we can ask about this book club? No? There's one question here, which is, depending on different translations, the sermon numbers differs. Why? That's true, Brother Murtaza, and I've seen it in other book clubs I'm doing as well. It really is because of the translators and the versions. In Nahjal Balagha, there is an original numbering system, which Sharif Radhi uses, which is then used by the one on Al-Islam. But then some people translated Nahjal Balagha into Persian and Urdu, and I've noticed that they changed the numbers, and one is added and one is before. One reason is because in Nahjal Balagha, sometimes you have identical sermons right next to each other, like literally identical, because Sharif Radhi wanted to compile everything that he found according to his methodology of eloquence. And sometimes they are named as 2 separate sermons, even though the text is exactly the same. And sometimes they are one big sermon, but with different versions. This is one reason why the numbers are different. Like, do you get it? But in general, it's only like 1 or 2 differences in number I've seen. So please make sure when you're looking, when I say letter 53, like maybe it's letter 52, maybe it's letter 54 in a different version, but you know what the letter content is. The content is the letter to Malik al-Ashtar, of which there is just one, unique in its magnificence and alone in its sublime nature in establishing justice amongst the people. There's a question, which is, where do you get knowledge from? If you mean like me, then for this discussion, I used and relied upon a commentary of Nahjal Balagha from Ayat al-Mutahhari, his views on Adl. Sheikh Shumali has a series on the same topic of the Adl of Nahjal Balagha, and I've also looked at his one. And there are lots of different articles commenting on the letter of Malik al-Ashtar. And I've compiled some of the thoughts from different ones, and I'll continue to do so in the next lecture. In fact, in the next lecture, next Wednesday, I'm going to mention a greater variety of ulama commenting on the sermon. So you'll see different sources which I have used from then. And of course, Sharif Radhi, his commentary. So that's the answer for where the knowledge is from, inshallah. Okay. If there are no more questions, then we will end. I'll ask you, inshallah, to remember me in your dua. Remember all of the mu'mineen in your dua as well. There's a request to read a Surah Fatiha for all mu'mineen mu'minat, inshallah. Especially those who are part of this community, part of the members of the book club, and all those people who have lived and died wishing for the justice of Ali ibn Abi Talib on this earth. We pray for the darajat of all of their souls, inshallah. Surah Al-Fatiha, beginning with Salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Allahumma sallam ala Muhammad wa ajil.